You're listening to New Churches Podcast, a production of Send Network on newchurches.com. We discuss all things church planting. If you're looking to take your next step toward multiplication, you're in the right place. Newchurches.com provides relevant and reliable resources for church planters, church multipliers, and disciple makers. Our growing library features pastors, planters, and church leaders like Ed Stetzer, David Platt, Trillia Newbell, Christine Hoover, Dahadi Lewis, Trevin Wax, and many others.
Hey, welcome back to the New Churches Podcast. My name is Noah Oldham, and I'm here with Vance Pitman. And today, Vance, we're continuing our two-part series discussing trauma-informed care in the local church. In our first episode, we discussed what it looks like to assess your city to determine the vulnerable populations. And now in this episode, we want to go look at ways that your church can respond based on that local assessment.
Yeah, and if you didn't listen to the first episode on this topic, you need to go back and listen, because our guest that I'm about to introduce really unpacked for us how to assess your city. And I think it's one of the things that, man, the church needs to understand, that the city is where God's called us. The church is the tool that he's established to engage the city with the gospel. And unfortunately, so many churches, they know everything about the church, but don't understand and assess their city that God's called them to. And so that previous episode is so important to understanding how to assess your city. The guest we have today, same guest from the last episode, Cassie Hammett. When God called us in Las Vegas and Hope Church to really raise the bar on what it looked like to engage our city with the gospel, we did a survey across the United States to find some places that were doing this in a gospel-centered format. And God just brought Cassie to our attention, and what she was doing with the hub there in Shreveport. She now also works with Send Relief as a missionary, both in Shreveport and in Las Vegas. But Cassie, we're thrilled to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me again.
And Cassie, last episode, you shared at this macro level of what it looks like for a church to assess their community to determine those vulnerable populations. I'd love just to follow up beginning this episode by talking about what should a church do now to assess themselves, so the resources and the giftings that they have to offer these vulnerable populations that they have identified.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important step for a church to not only identify what ways they want to engage their city, but to identify how, not just the who, but the how. Because I think from great intentions, I think we can charge out and, we can get all worked up and make a plan and go out into the community and not be sustainable. And the worst thing that we can do for vulnerable populations is not show up consistently. Is to kind of show up a few times and fizzle out because we didn't count the cost beforehand. So it's good to feel called, but it's also good to use wisdom, and it's good to really have a good hard look at your church, the people in it. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the questions we would ask. So from a leadership standpoint, one of the things I always want to ask a leader is, what are you passionate about? I was just in a recent conversation with a church out in Denver, and I was so refreshed by the pastor's response to that question, because he was able to say, man, the Lord has really broken me when it comes to street homelessness. But there have been other pastors and other leaders that I've spoken to that when I ask, so what do you care about? Like, what keeps you up at night? They've just sort of been like, well, why does that doesn't matter. What are the needs? And it's like, well, it does matter, because you're chosen. The mantle is on your shoulders. You've been chosen to pastor this church. And so when you think about your city, the things that keep you up at night are a part of that calling, and it matters. So for those in leadership to be able to answer, what are you passionate about? What keeps you up? What bothers you the most about your city? And why that's a good first question is because sometimes they don't have an answer. And that is because sometimes they haven't paid attention. And so it can point someone to, if a pastor or a leader can't answer that question, it actually is pointing them to a different question, which is, why don't I know the vulnerable stuff in my city that would keep me up at night? Why can't I answer that? And so that's one place we start with leaders, because we want leaders to be leading in the relational side of vulnerability. That is what we've seen in Shreveport. We have 42 different church partners that engage with us on a regular basis, which in the South is a miracle that we have that many. But what we find is that the churches that are having the biggest impact among vulnerable populations, anytime they're showing up, the pastor's there or someone in leadership is there. And they're saying, come do this with me, not I'm sending you. So I think asking leadership what matters to you is sort of where we would start too. But when it comes to
And Cassie, hey, before you leave that, hey, Cassie, before you leave the leader thing, I want to add this, because I know we have a lot of church planters that listen to this podcast. And something Cassie just said is critical to the church planter's mindset. And that is, don't think of yourself going to that city as a pastor of a church. Think of yourself as a missionary engaging the city with the gospel. Too many church planters go out and their first thought is about a weekend service, a weekend gathering, find a place to meet, get some people together so I can preach my sermon. And many church planting missionaries become pastors. But before they're pastors, they're missionaries to engage the city. Yeah. Paul never pastored a church that he planted. He went in as the missionary to engage the city. Then he raised up leadership and passed the baton. But today it's not wrong for the missionary to become the pastor. But part of thinking like a missionary is, Cassie, what you're talking about. It's as a leader understanding what my city is, who my city is, what makes up my city, what are the needs of my city, what are the hurts, what are the dreams of my city, what are the desires and desires of God and aspirations of my city. So thinking through all of that is part of thinking like a missionary, and so critical. And so I didn't want to pass that without. So starting with the leadership is critical.
Yeah, and I think too, the ultimate goal of any kind of engagement in your city among the vulnerable populations would be ultimately that they would possibly find a spot to belong in your church body. And so if leadership is not involved relationally with the vulnerable, and then they walk through their front doors and they're sitting in their seats, then leadership will not know how to lead them, because you cannot. And I have had this conversation with Vance and leadership at Hope for years. You just can't use the same template when it comes to the vulnerable in your church. You just cannot use the same template. And so when leadership is engaging with the vulnerable, it brings a level of knowing even to how to disciple those populations. So yes, I think what you're saying, Vance, is critical. The other questions we would ask about a church is very asset-based. What already exists? What's already there? I will say this out in Vegas with Hope. What existed was a pastor who was bothered by the vulnerabilities in the city and a clear vision. I remember the first time we went to church at Hope Church, Brent and my husband walked and got in the car, and I was like, that is the clearest vision I have ever heard. Like, I literally was like, I'll go anywhere with that man. But I think, and that's again pointing to the importance of leadership. But I think a church, no matter the size, a church already has a ton of assets. If you have people who are coming, you have assets. People in your congregation, what are their gifts? What skills exist in that group of people? What careers exist? What spheres of influence are there? When you're looking at your church, what do people have extra of? Because the answer is more than likely going to be they have extra of something. Yeah. And sometimes what churches don't do is they don't ask. They don't ask the people sitting in the audience, hey, or sitting in the congregation, what do you guys have? They just go, well, we've got to get the budget for it. When in reality, if you ask members in your congregation, you are tying them with their own stuff. You are tying them to the process of serving the city. My husband always jokes, don't tell Cassie what you do for a living. Like when we go to a party, he's always like, listen, don't tell her, because she will ask you to do it for free. But the truth is, like, in every circle of people, there is so much that can be leveraged without having to even raise a dollar. Here in Shreveport, we sort of have a little ragtag approach to what we do. We're a really large organization, but we still operate in a way that says, if there is something we need, who has it? That's the question we're always asking. Not, here's a check, let us pay for it, but who in our city has it? Because what we see happen is, if we go, let's say, for example, we need, like right now we're looking for a new psychiatrist. This is just an example. We could just start paying one that we found in the, on Google, or we could go into the community, find someone who cares about the populations we're serving, maybe who's plugged into a local church, come alongside them relationally. And now all of a sudden they're getting the ability to serve vulnerable people because we asked them to give us what they already have. So we could just write a check for that, but a better option is asking someone else for it. Not because we just want what they have, but what we see happen over and over again is they're changed because now they get the ability to serve the vulnerable populations. And so asking asset-based questions, saying, what do we already have? What giftings? And then in your church, what are people passionate about? What naturally comes to the surface when you ask what they care about in the city? Are there a ton of foster families in your church? Well, that's a cue that possibly there's a lot of people who care about child-specific issues. And so I think it's just, again, putting the lens of what do we already have before we start trying to figure out what we don't have. Because a lot can change by just asking what we already have. And then the next part of it would be, what is the capacity? This is a really important question that a lot of churches do not ask, because I think there's this, I would call it an unhealthy assumption that because we're all called to kingdom work, it doesn't matter what our capacity is. But that's actually very toxic, because not everything in the kingdom has our name on it. Okay, so we need to be asking, what is our actual capacity? What do we have people for? What do we have budget for? What do we have? Like, how can we start in a way that allows us to still be doing this in 5 years versus how do we just come out of the gate really strong and then have to be like, like a duck underwater, your feet are just like, oh my gosh, we can't sustain this. Because what eventually happens, if you don't ask the capacity question, you're already going to start in your church with the same 20% of people who do all the crazy things. You know what I'm saying? Like, I say this in our breakouts, but we can all think of people who, when there's like an outreach, it's always the same people. It's always me. It's always like, but what happens is if you don't have a capacity conversation, that dwindles and dwindles and dwindles over time to where now you don't have the ability to keep that going. And that is very damaging. And so what we would say is, if you don't have the capacity to do it right now, don't do it. Like, at least plan far enough to know that we can stay in these people's lives for the long term. And then make a plan for how to keep it sustainable. I think that's another thing that people don't talk about is someone has to be keeping this thing sustainable for it to make any sort of impact, because serving vulnerable populations in a way that is biblical and holistic and actually brings restoration takes a really long time. And so seeing real change is going to take years versus months.
Totally. And Cassie, I want to add to what you've just said for the pastors and planters that are listening to this. So when I heard Cassie, give us this information, we began to think about this in a couple of ways. First of all, Bob Roberts once said to me, Vance, what if you thought about the church is the missionary in the city? So if you think about sending a missionary to a city, you think about, what does that missionary do? Are they a doctor? Are they a contractor? Are they a school teacher? And then you build platforms for them to engage the community based on the skill set that they bring to the table. You don't send a doctor to Afghanistan to build houses. You send a doctor to Afghanistan to use medicine as a platform. So what if the church is the missionary in the city? So you have to do what Cassie's described. You have to assess who we are then. And I think about it in two lanes: resources and relationships. What are the resources we have? That can be money, that can be skills, that can be occupations, that can be jobs. And then what are the relationships? Who are we connected to? And when Cassie taught us all of this, one of the major planks of our engagement ministry now at Hope that's developed over the last 5 to 7 years is in the arena of foster care. And it happened because we had a nucleus of families when we assessed ourselves that were already engaged there. And now we've been able to take and build upon that with the resources and the relationships that they had, this thriving ministry that I would say, I mean, we're shaping foster care in Southern Nevada probably as much as Department of Family Services in our engagement level. But it was born out of this assessing and understanding. So at Hope, and we can put this in the show notes, but at Hope, we do a thing that every year or two, we do what's called a domain survey, where we ask our people, what are your jobs? So we know at Hope, our primary jobs and skill levels, we can tell you as a church who we are and how we're wired, and then leverage that for engagement. So I think for local churches to think about what Cassie's saying is huge, because you have to know who you are. You can spin the globe, put your finger down, there's need everywhere. How do you know which need you're called to meet? Understanding who you are through resources and relationships. And that's what Cassie's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That's so good. All right, Cassie. So a church has assessed their local community and they've determined the vulnerable populations. And now they've assessed their own church and what they're passionate about and what they have resources for and what they have capacity for. What steps do they now take to begin to engage vulnerable populations with trauma-informed care?
Yeah, so I think going back to what we said about trauma-informed care is the good news about learning about this is that the more you know about trauma and trauma-informed care, actually the better human you can be. Because the reality is anyone that you're interacting with has 90% chance has experienced something traumatic. So that's what's really cool about doing the work of learning about trauma, is that it doesn't just apply or help you in one category. It can help you parent. It can help you with your barista at the coffee shop, a friend of yours. It's an incredible tool to use. And so, like I said, there's some pillars to what trauma-informed care is, sort of the way that they check, I guess, boxes you could check. Safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. Those are sort of the most understood categories of trauma-informed care. I think what's important for individuals to know, especially those in leadership, about trauma, is that it is not just an emotional response or an emotional issue. So trauma actually completely rewires your brain. And so when that happens, it actually changes a person. Like, it can change a person. I think we often think about trauma through the lens of emotions. So we may look at someone and say, oh, well, she's not crying, so she must not be that upset. Or when we asked her if she was okay, she said she was fine, which all the females listening are like, if I say I'm fine, it means I'm not fine, actually. But I want to kind of run through some of the effects of trauma, because I think it's important for us to know sort of the far-reaching effects that trauma can have on our lives. So it impairs memory, concentration, the ability to regulate your emotions. All that means is the ability to self-regulate and dial your emotions down. It impairs healthy behavior, new learning, and focus. It impairs pretty much everything that people ask victims of trauma to do. Often you hear, calm down, concentrate, and tell me what happened. Okay, well, that's emotional regulation, concentration, and memory. Those are 3 things that have completely been hijacked when someone has been through trauma. So it's just important to know these things, because we may be going into a conversation with someone in our congregation and asking them to do things that they legitimately may not have the brain power to do. And there's a lot of research that shows that it actually does change your brain's power and its ability. It impacts, and these are kind of profound, especially when it comes to pastoring or leading. It impacts your ability to trust. So when someone's been through trauma, the last thing they want to do is trust a pastor. The very last thing they want to do. I can tell you that from 15 plus years of experience with those who have been through trauma. It impacts your ability to cope with even small negative things or even small stressors. It impacts your formation of healthy relationships, your ability to form healthy relationships. You cannot self-soothe anymore, and it becomes very difficult to distinguish between safe and unsafe people. So those are some major, major impacts that are tied directly to discipleship. If you think about it, when people say we want the gospel to go forth, I had a really interesting conversation with someone once where we explained all the things we do for a victim of human trafficking. And I used an example of a victim we had just recently had. And I got all the way to the end of it. And this individual said, well, but when do you share the gospel? And I was like, oh, we don't in that scenario and in that setting. And this is why. So one of the things that we always say is if the gospel is the greatest treasure, which it is, then we need to treat it like a treasure, and we need to hand it out in a way that treats it like the treasure that it is, in a way that someone can receive it and it can actually go forth in their lives. And if we don't know the ways that trauma impacts a person, that can be the biggest barrier to them understanding the gospel or accepting the gospel. We want the gospel to be the answer for someone who's been through trauma. If you imagine someone's just been through something very traumatic. In our world, maybe she's just been arrested for prostitution, or maybe she's been sold, for nights on end. And a Christian comes to her in jail or crosses her path and says, well, God has a plan for you. Well, yes, that's true. But that is not trauma informed, because for someone who has been sold for 7 or 8 nights in a row and been beaten beyond recognition, what kind of God and that God's plan would do this to me? So I think it's just remembering that trauma can be a huge hurdle for the gospel going forth in someone's life. And because it is the greatest treasure, we need to hand it off to someone in a way that is healthy and timed correctly, and also respects what trauma has done in their life and doesn't rush to delivering the gospel from an agenda, but understands that if I introduce anything about the gospel in this moment, it could actually do the exact opposite, which would be a higher wall could go up to believing that a God even exists. So I think it's just remembering that trauma really does change people, and that as people heal from trauma, the gospel can go forth in their life. And I'm not saying you don't tell them, God loves you, he has a plan for you. But I do think it's important for us to put ourselves on that side of the equation and say, how would that feel to hear? How would it feel to hear that at the bottom of the barrel of life, someone is looking at me saying, God won't give you more than you can handle? Which I don't even think is biblical, but a lot of Christians say that. But can you imagine what that would feel like?
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to have anything to do with that God or anyone related to him. So I think the importance of just a basic knowledge of how trauma impacts someone could be the difference between the gospel going forth in their life or not, or them sort of shutting down in that moment. So I think starting with understanding how it impacts a person, and then understanding you could accidentally and unintentionally, always, no one would intentionally do this, but there is such a thing as unintentional harm. And that comes from a lack of understanding. And so people would say, well, I would never want to re-traumatize someone. Well, of course, no one would want to. No pastor would want to, no leader would want to, but they can unintentionally re-traumatize someone if they don't have a baseline knowledge of how to keep that from happening. And so what we say is there's a lot of things that hurt, but there's a lot of things that help. And those 5 things, safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, those are the things that help. Those are sort of the pathways that can open up someone to be able to navigate a relationship with you. And of course, that looks different, in every single scenario. We could talk about what does it look like to have a trauma-informed church service, all the way down to a trauma-informed staff that is trained to know how to handle things that come through the door. I know that out in Vegas, Travis, who is now at Sin Network, I was always going to Travis like, hey, we need to change this and we need to change that. And he was always rolling his eyes at me because I'm like, hey, but man, like there is a lot of work that can be done in making your environment where people are gathering to hear the gospel as hospitable to victims of trafficking as you possibly can. And it may seem like too big of a task, but the reality is it's actually quite simple. If you read about trauma-informed care, there are some really practical things you can do, even on a Sunday, to be a place that feels more welcoming for victims of trafficking. One big thing that I think is something to think about is, during prayer time, during altar time, often the only individuals there to pray for people are male. And that is not very trauma-informed, because if a woman is in the audience that has been exploited or abused by a male, there is no chance that she's going to go down to the front and open her life up to someone. So that's a really simple one, really simple change, but a major, major change, because that, again, is the difference between someone coming down and making some sort of massive spiritual decision or not. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal that we pay attention to those little nuanced things. And any amount of work you'll do in trauma-informed care, you are advocating for people who haven't even come through your doors yet. And any amount of work you'll do to be a church that's ready for it, you're already doing something for the vulnerable just by doing that. Because Vance can tell you, it's a whole different ballgame to have vulnerable populations sitting in your service. I know for us, we serve the homeless and people in poverty out in Vegas, and they're louder and rowdier and very vocal. And, when we consult churches and train churches, we say your prayer team needs to be trauma informed, because when you have very vulnerable populations coming through your doors, what they're bringing down to prayer is going to be significantly different than possibly other people in your congregation, bigger, maybe more traumatic, more complicated. And so I think it goes past just the leadership. It goes all the way down through your volunteers as well.
Yeah.
Making sure that individuals that they're encountering are ready for them, ready to be able to be a welcoming place. I think that is a really big part of the conversation as well.
Cassie, I want to thank you personally as a pastor for the way you've helped us and the way you've helped me as a pastor and our church in Vegas. And now that we've raised up a new pastor there, the way they continue to engage the city, I want to thank you for your passion and for what you've done today in helping many churches that are leaning in and listening to this to prepare. And I want to kind of finish on one thing that you talked about, and that is the gospel. And some people may hear what you said and think, oh, she's backing off sharing the gospel. And I've known Cassie and her ministry now for almost a decade. And this is one of the most gospel-centered ministries that I've ever been exposed to, and how she leads it. But Eric Swanson said something once in a book that he wrote that said, when it comes to the gospel, we need to serve people with an ultimate motive, but not an ulterior motive. And I'm afraid often churches talk about ministries like this with an ulterior motive so that we can put notches in our belt of gospel conversations. Obviously, our ultimate motive is that every man, woman, child comes to know the love of God through Jesus Christ and enters into a personal relationship with him. That's our ultimate motive. But we serve people because Jesus has called us to serve people, whether they ever come to him or not. And we want to serve them because Jesus in us, Christ in us, desires to serve them and love them. And we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our city. And I think that's the message for our churches listening to this, is understand your city, understand who you are as a church, and then figure out practical ways to be the hands and feet of Jesus in loving the least of these in your city. And Jesus said, when you do that, you've done it unto me.
You've been listening to the New Churches Podcast, brought to you by Send Network. If you like what you heard, take a few minutes to rate and review us or share this episode with a friend. It's the best way to show your support. To find more reliable resources to start your new church well, visit newchurches.com.